motion and leaving me there to die. I tell myself,
don't you pick with me, cause you know that
while her world.
The phone rang late. Not the kind of ring that belongs to daytime life. Appointments, errands, voices that expect you to answer. This was the other kind. The kind that makes your stomach tighten before your hand even moves. Because late-night calls don't feel like communication. They feel like interruption, like something pushing through the dark. She stared at it for a second too long, and when she finally picked up, her voice didn't sound confident. It sounded careful, almost afraid to disturb whatever silence she had managed to build. "Hello?" There was a pause, a breath, and then a voice that didn't belong in the living world anymore. Soft, casual, unmistakably familiar. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. For a moment, she forgot what year it was. For a moment, the room stopped being a room and became a memory. And the voice said her name like it had said it 1,000 times before. Like nothing had ever ended. Like the impossible had simply decided to return. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. Grief doesn't always arrive like a wave. Sometimes it arrives like dust. It settles on everything slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you've been living inside it. You've been breathing it. You've been swallowing it without noticing. And then something small happens. A sound, a smell, a phone ringing in the wrong hour, and suddenly the dust becomes a storm. After John Lennon died, the world treated it like an event. A tragedy with a headline, a moment frozen in time. But for the person left behind, it wasn't a moment. It was a new atmosphere, a permanent shift in the way silence sounded. In the years that followed, there were days when the world felt too loud, days when the world felt too curious, days when strangers wanted her to explain what couldn't be explained. And so she built walls, not dramatic walls, not angry walls, just quiet ones, routines, distance, a controlled life where she could decide what came in and what stayed out. Because when someone is taken suddenly, you become protective of your reality. You become careful with your heart. You learn how easily it can be tricked. And that's why that phone call, years later, wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. Because it wasn't a stranger's voice, it wasn't a fan, it wasn't a reporter, it was him. Or at least, it sounded like him. The story has been told as a prank, a celebrity anecdote, a "can you believe this happened" moment from music history. But if you sit with it for more than a second, it becomes something else, because the call didn't reach a public figure. It reached a widow. It reached a woman who had already lived through the moment when the world stopped making sense. And the man who placed that call wasn't cruel, not in the way people imagine pranksters to be. His name was Maurice Gibb, 1/3 of the Bee Gees. A voice in the harmonies that shaped an era. A face people associate with bright suits, bright stages, bright music. But Maurice was never only brightness. People who knew him closely described him as sensitive, almost painfully so. The kind of person who could walk into a room and feel what nobody was saying. The kind of person who could sense sadness and try to smother it with laughter. And Maurice had a gift, not just for music, for imitation, for voices. He could slip into another person's rhythm so naturally that it startled people. He didn't do it to humiliate. He did it to entertain, to lighten the air, to change the temperature of a room. Sometimes the impression was a kind of kindness, a distraction, a rescue. And John Lennon's voice, John Lennon's presence, was something Maurice could mimic well enough that it made people turn their heads. That's the part everyone remembers. The Bee Gee who could become John Lennon for a moment. The punchline is always the same. Maurice called Yoko Ono pretending to be John, and she believed him, at least for a moment. But the part that lingers isn't the belief. It's the moment before she realized, the moment where hope woke up, because hope is not polite. It doesn't wait for logic. It doesn't ask permission. It rises, it rushes, it grabs the heart before the mind can intervene. And if you've lived with grief long enough, hope becomes rare. It becomes almost sacred. So when that voice arrived through the phone line, familiar, warm, casual, it didn't just remind her of John, it brought him back, not in reality, but in feeling. And feeling is what grief protects most. This is where the story becomes hard to tell, because it forces you to imagine her side of it. Imagine the late hour, the quiet room, the stillness of a life rebuilt around absence. Imagine the phone lighting up in the dark. Imagine the hand lifting it. Imagine the first second of sound. And then imagine the sudden shock of recognition, a voice that belongs to your past, speaking as if it never left. That moment, however brief, is the part nobody knows how to talk about, because it's too intimate, too human, too close to the bone. And it raises a question that never goes away. Why did Maurice do it? There are versions of the story that treat it like harmless fun, like a silly act between famous people. But Maurice wasn't naive. He knew who John Lennon was. He knew what John meant to the world. And he knew what John meant to her. So the answer can't be simple. Maybe Maurice thought he was giving her a laugh, a small, surreal relief from a life surrounded by heaviness. Maybe he thought it would be a bright moment, a strange story to tell later, a reminder that music still held joy. Or maybe this is the part that feels truer the longer you sit with it. Maybe Maurice wasn't only doing it for her. Maybe he needed to hear that voice too. Because behind the Bee Gees' success was a family that lived inside pressure, inside expectations, inside closeness so intense it sometimes turned into conflict. Maurice spent years trying to keep things smooth between his brothers, trying to keep the world from seeing cracks. He was the peacemaker, the funny one, the one who made people laugh before they could fall apart. But laughter can be a mask, and masks get heavy. There was something about Maurice that people often missed, a fragility under the charm, a sadness that didn't always show itself until later. And sometimes, when someone carries their own sadness, they make choices they don't fully understand in the moment. They reach for the edge of something forbidden, not to hurt someone, but to feel alive, to feel control, to feel anything other than their own quiet fear. If Maurice truly fooled her, if she truly believed, even briefly, then that call wasn't just a prank. It was a collision between grief and humor, between memory and imitation, between what's gone and what still echoes. And the strangest part is what happened afterward. Because if this were simply cruel, the story would end with outrage, with a public feud, with consequences. But it didn't. Instead, it dissolved into silence, a silence so complete that it almost feels intentional, like everyone involved understood something about that moment that couldn't be turned into entertainment. Because there are some things you can't laugh about twice. And whatever happened in the seconds after she realized, whatever her voice did, whatever her breath did, whatever her heart did, that part has always been kept at a distance, as if even Maurice didn't want to touch it again. And yet, the story survived. It traveled quietly through music circles like a whispered rumor, a strange little moment that people repeated, half smiling. But if you listen closely, the half smile never sounds clean. It sounds nervous, like the teller is unsure whether they're allowed to laugh. Because beneath the joke there is a private question nobody can answer. When the call ended, what stayed behind in the room? In the days after that call, nothing exploded. No headlines, no public outrage, no statements, which, in a strange way, made it feel heavier. Because when something truly cruel happens, the world reacts. But when something confusing happens, something that sits in the space between laughter and pain, it often disappears into silence. And silence is where grief likes to live. Maurice didn't speak about it publicly, not in any confirmed way. He didn't turn it into a story for interviews, didn't polish it into a joke. And the people around him, the ones who knew him well, noticed something familiar in that. Maurice could be the loudest person in a room until he wasn't, until the laughter ended, until the performance was over. Then he would become quiet in a way that felt almost private, like he was stepping behind a curtain no one else could follow. It's tempting to think of that call as a one-off, a strange impulse, a reckless moment. But Maurice's life was filled with moments like that, moments where humor touched something fragile. Because for him, humor wasn't only entertainment, it was defense. It was how he kept the darkness from settling too close. And the darkness wasn't a rumor. It was documented in the patterns people saw, the mood shifts, the sensitivity, the way he could be deeply affected by things he didn't always explain. He was a man who felt a lot, sometimes too much, which is why the Yoko call matters, because it wasn't just about Yoko. It was about what kind of man would reach for a dead man's voice, and what kind of emptiness makes that seem like a good idea. Maurice had always been fascinated by presence, not fame, presence, that invisible thing that makes someone feel alive in a room even when they aren't speaking. John Lennon had that. Even after he was gone, his presence lingered in the way people spoke his name carefully. The way music fans talked about him like he was still supposed to return. In the way grief refused to let him become past tense. Maurice, in his own way, understood that kind of haunting, because the Bee Gees weren't just a band, they were a family. And family doesn't just give you love, it gives you echoes. It gives you voices that follow you through your life. Maurice grew up hearing his brothers' voices so closely that they became part of his own identity. Barry's authority, Robin's intensity, the blend of harmonies that felt inseparable. But being inseparable can become its own kind of loneliness, because when your entire life is built around togetherness, you don't always learn how to be alone. And Maurice, more than anyone, seemed to fear being alone with himself. That fear can make a person reckless, not loudly reckless, quietly. The kind of reckless that looks like humor, like a prank, like a story people repeat with a smile. But underneath, it can be something else. A man reaching for a feeling he can't create in his own life. A man borrowing someone else's power because he doesn't know how to access his own. The people who tell this story often stop at the moment Yoko realized. They skip over what happened next, because the next part isn't funny. It's human, and it's uncomfortable, because once the illusion breaks, there are only a few possible outcomes. One is anger, another is laughter, but the most haunting outcome is neither. It's quiet. It's a pause so long you can hear someone trying not to fall apart. And if that's what happened, if Yoko went quiet, if she simply listened for a second too long, then Maurice would have heard it. He would have heard the moment the grief returned. He would have heard the air leave the room. And Maurice was not the kind of man who could ignore a sound like that. That's what makes the story feel unresolved. Because even if the call ended with awkward laughter, even if someone tried to smooth it over, Maurice would still be left with the knowledge that he had opened a door that should have stayed closed. A door that led straight into someone's private loss. And then there's the other side of the silence. Yoko did not publicly attack him. At least, there's no widely verified record of her doing so. No big scandal, no famous feud, just distance. And distance can be more painful than anger. Anger means the wound is active. Distance means the wound has become part of the person. It means the person has learned to live around it. So the call didn't create drama. It created a question. And questions are heavier because they don't end, they just sit, they linger. And Maurice had always been the kind of man who didn't like lingering pain. He wanted to fix the mood, fix the moment, fix the room. But some things can't be fixed. Some things can only be carried. And that's where Maurice's life began to tilt. Not immediately, not in a way the public could see, but in the private ways that matter. He drank, he struggled, he laughed loudly, and sometimes the laughter sounded like it was fighting something. He stayed the funny one, even as the years went on, even as the world changed, even as the Bee Gees' image shifted from unstoppable to nostalgic, even as people started speaking about the past like it was safer than the present. And Maurice seemed to live with one foot in the past. Not because he couldn't move forward, but because the past was where the voices were, the voices of childhood, the voices of early success, the voices of people who were still alive in memory, even when they weren't alive in the world. Which brings us back to that phone call. Because the eerie thing about voices is that they can resurrect people. Not truly, not physically, but emotionally. They can make you feel like someone is still reachable. And once you experience that, once you witness it, you can become addicted to it, to the illusion, to the comfort of pretending nothing has ended. Maurice had that illusion in his hands for a moment, and afterward he couldn't unfeel what he had felt. Not because he wanted to hurt someone, but because for a brief moment he had stepped into a kind of power, the power to make the dead sound alive. And somewhere deep down, he must have understood the cost of that power, because years later, people who knew Maurice would say that certain stories stayed with him. Not the glamorous stories, not the awards, not the bright nights, but the quiet ones. The ones that made him stare off, mid-laugh, as if he had remembered something he couldn't rewrite. And the Yoko call was one of those stories. A moment that began as humor, but ended as something heavier, something unfinished, something that waited. Because the real truth isn't in the prank. The real truth is in what that prank revealed about Maurice himself. And the closer he got to the end of his life, the more it seemed like he was trying to make peace with something, not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, like a man walking through his own memories, looking for the place where he crossed a line, and wondering if he could ever step back. There's a reason this story never fully settled into comedy, because if it were only funny, Maurice would have told it proudly. He would have repeated it at dinners, on late-night couches, in that easy way performers relive the moments they know will land. But he didn't, not in any confirmed way. And that absence says more than the prank ever could. Years later, people close to Maurice described him as a man who carried invisible weight, especially as life grew quieter and the spotlight softened. He still made people laugh, still slipped into voices, still filled rooms with warmth. But there were moments when his expression changed, as if he'd heard something no one else could hear. Maybe that phone call was one of those echoes, because the emotional truth wasn't that he fooled Yoko Ono. The emotional truth was that, for a moment, he borrowed a dead man's voice and realized how desperately the living still needed it. He realized how thin the wall is between memory and pain, how quickly love turns into longing, and how grief doesn't end. It only learns to hide. Some people believe Maurice meant it as comfort. Others see it as reckless. The truth is probably quieter than both. It was a human mistake made by a man who used humor to survive his own feelings. And when he heard the shift on the other end of the line, when he sensed the moment the illusion broke, he understood something he couldn't laugh away, that voices are sacred because they don't just entertain us, they bring people back, and sometimes they bring them back too sharply. In the end, Maurice Gibb didn't leave behind a scandal. He left behind a kind of tenderness, the sense that he was always trying to keep the darkness away from the people he cared about, even when he didn't know the right way. And maybe that's why this story still lingers, not as gossip, but as a quiet reminder that legends aren't made of myth. They're made of moments, some bright, some regretted, some too private to explain. And one night, a phone rang in the dark, and for a moment, grief mistook imitation for love. Then the line went silent again, and the world kept moving. But somewhere inside that silence, the echo stayed.